Hey guys, so what we're going to be doing this week is building off of your thought letter and turning it into more of a draft. Some people do have drafts. It depends on how you wrote your thought letter. If you did it as like a word vomit, you might not have as much of a draft. If you did an outline, then yours might look a little bit more drafty. We're not turning this in formally as a Google Doc. As we talked about, this is, and you've noticed that the examples, this is something we're going to eventually turn into a website. So whether you have like a single document or you like want to copy and paste and make several, it's entirely up to you. So if you want to, delete or work on your thought letter and turn that into your draft, you can. If you want to start from scratch on a new document, it's totally fine. What we're starting with in this first video is some ideas for how to organize. It's really important to know and to be thinking about what kind of argument you are making, or at least some ideas, because that tells you how you're going to organize it. And we're going to go through a couple of models, kind of based on the argument type that you may have chosen in the previous brainstorming. So if you decided you wanted to clear up misconceptions, there's a kind of a best model for that. If you decide you want to do problem solution or advantages or changing opinions with each of these, there's kind of a way of organizing it that's going to be the strongest or kind of make the most sense. So we're going to go through those. And it's kind of open brainstorming during this part. You're, welcome in your notebook to, welcome, you should make some notes from the presentation, but most of all, it's kind of about recording ideas as I'm going through the different models, kind of paying attention to which model type you might kind of work best for you. And I'm going to kind of walk you through it as I go. So the first couple of tips that I want to talk about changing things is, first, I want to clear up the thesis myth. I think when everyone learned like 5-paragraph essays was kind of part of the model that at the end of the introduction, that is where you put your thesis statement, but you actually have more options than that. So a couple of things is, I want to point out that it can go in a couple of places. And again, it might depend on what sort of model or organization strategy you choose. It can go at the beginning. You can do the traditional, like, here's my introduction, paragraph or two for the introduction. At the end of it, that is where I'm going to state what the point of my paper is, what my argument is going to be. Cool. That works best for issues that are not super controversial, because if you're thinking about it like an issue that's controversial, typically you're assuming that you have a really clear like other side. There's kind of a more obvious like for or against kind of a debate. And in that situation, you kind of have to assume about your audience. We talked about thinking about characteristics of your audience. Your audience probably knows a lot about this issue. So probably already feel very strongly. So if you start with an argumentative thesis before you really get into anything, it's less likely that they're going to read it, because they might be immediately like defensive or off-put early on. It might work better instead to end that introduction with kind of a guiding question, like here's what we're going to be talking about or considering or something to think about. And then instead you put your thesis statement in the conclusion after you've kind of led your audience kind of through the information that you want to present. In a problem solution argument, sometimes advantages and disadvantages, where there's clearly like two sort of big like parts of the essay, the same with the Rogerian argument, which we'll talk more about later. The thesis statement might be what you begin the solution part of the paper with, in maybe that first paragraph of that second part of the paper, and then you might come back to it at the end, so be more in the middle of the paper. And again, in the putting the thesis statement at the end, It's, again, like if it's a controversial issue or a very passionate audience, it's best maybe to have that guiding question and the thesis at the end. If it's not controversial or there's less of a, you want to maybe bring awareness, it's your audience probably doesn't know that much about it. They're not super passionate or defensive, so it's fine to put that thesis statement at the beginning. So it's perfectly okay to think about if you need to. For your audience's sake, in order to get them to be more open to hearing what you have to say, starting with a question rather than a thesis statement. Another thing to consider is background information. When we're talking about the thesis statement and placement, we were talking about like considering whether the issue was controversial and where your audience was with it. You also want to think about knowledge and what your audience maybe knows about this issue already. So all writing usually includes some sort of reader like necessary background context for the problem, which you should, through your annotated bibliography, have some sources kind of ready for that. And this is where you might play catch up with them, kind of getting them up to speed, or possibly even like setting the scene and convincing them of a problem you want to address. Like if you're doing problem solution, you might spend some time like addressing what the problem is and explaining it, proving that it's happening, getting people to be aware of it. So a couple of things you want to think about. Just like there's a thesis myth, there's kind of a background myth where you just, it's all the same, like all backgrounds are the same and you just put all the background in that section. And that's not really how it works. You want to be really selective with what you put in the background section. For instance, if your audience knows a lot about the issue, and I believe we talked about this at the very beginning of the semester, if they know a lot about the issue, you don't want to bore them to death with a lot of random information that they either don't need for this essay or that they already know. You want to make sure you're giving people like exactly what they need that fits the point. So even background sections are a little bit argumentative because you don't really just want to lay like everything in there without your reader knowing why they need this information. So a couple of things to think about. One, you do want to provide necessary information that the reader does not know, and you do want to have a point. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have an argumentative point, but there should be some sort of topic for that part of the paper. Your reader shouldn't just have like a blanket of dates and terms and stuff that they're just like, why am I reading this? What am I supposed to be doing? And not having a point. Oh, sorry, I did some jumping around there. The next thing is also thinking about your introduction and conclusion. You want to make sure you're making really careful choices with the intro and the conclusion. In the annotated bibliography, we were not trying to be engaging. In the digital essay, we are trying to be engaging. You are trying to engage and keep your reader engaged throughout the essay and leave them with something to think about. So here's a couple of things. One, with introductions, a common error that people kind of make is diving in with bland information, like in 1898. I mean, maybe some people enjoy reading like essays that start out with random dates, but if you would be bored by that, your reader probably will too. Definitions as well. I don't know too many people that really like to read the dictionary, so if you wouldn't be super like into reading like lots of formal definitions, again, your reader probably doesn't want to either. So you want to think about things that are going to be engaging, like questions, current events, like especially like questions that are probing, like surprising statistics, hypothetical situations. On the other end, like trying to avoid the broad, like throughout time, that kind of thing. You want to make sure you're really getting into something that is going to hook your reader, and that's what it's called, like starting out with a hook, something that's going to make them want to read more. And what you want to cover is that hook, something to engage your reader. Give very brief context. Don't get overboard or ramble and go off on tangents. It's really easy to do that in the introduction. I struggle with that, going through and give all kinds of information and have to go back and start cutting. So make it like very brief context and then explain the goal, either that guiding question or the thesis. And this could be 1 or 2 paragraphs. Your conclusion, try not to start your conclusion with the words in conclusion. Get a little creative. I think that that's another kind of leftover symptom of the 5-paragraph essay. Yeah, and the other thing is just reiterating like what you've already said in other places. It's okay to like wrap up and all that stuff. Like you definitely want to do that, but you don't want to just stop after you do that. Like you want to make sure like you remind people of like what the main point is and all that. Yes, maybe finally get to your thesis statement if that's what you're doing, but then also leave your reader with something. It's almost like a hook in reverse. Like you start the paper with a hook to make them read the rest, and then you end with the hook so that they're thinking about it when they're done. Almost like a takeaway point or a final thought. Again, like same things like a scenario, a point, a suggestion, a question, a quote. So those make good openings too. Something that's going to stick with them and be thought-provoking so that they take it with them. So those are some things to think about for your intro and your conclusion. So here's some other organizing tips. We're going to get into those models by argument type. So far we've gone over ideas for the thesis and where it goes in the intro and the conclusion and some background information. So now we're getting into ideas for how you might arrange the body of that essay. One is the topical pattern. And again, like the best way to go about this is to go back and think about like what you wrote in your previous brainstorming in your thought letter. What kind of argument are you doing? We went through a couple of different ideas there and asked you to think about one or two that might really work for you. So something to think about is, again, like these are really good for arguments that are more about like either changing opinions or arguing to take action, clearing up misconceptions. This really works, and the thesis can go at the beginning or the end with this one depending on how controversial the issue is. But there's two types here. So if you're doing like changing opinions or taking action, that kind of thing, you're probably doing something point by point where it's like you have your thesis statement and then here are the reasons. You know what I mean? It's a pretty standard traditional format. The 5-paragraph essay uses this point-by-point format where you have like, after your intro, you have like your 3 reasons. Don't do 3 body paragraphs because that would be way too long. Split it up, you know. But the point-by-point, like here, and maybe organizing it from like your weakest point to your strongest point and then concluding. Complete refutation. I'm going to go over refutations a little bit later, but this works specifically for if you are spending your entire essay clearing up misconceptions. So for instance, if you're writing about maybe addressing a stereotype or a myth that you want to debunk, like I want to address this group of people or this particular audience that holds this thinking or this opinion or this way of addressing this, and I just want to point out faulty thinking or ask them to think about it a different way. Again, like I think I've talked about this before, like if you go to those online articles, if you are online and you find those things that are like those articles that are like 5 myths, and they do like the myth, where it came from, and then why it's incorrect, that's sort of the model. Where it's not arranged by you making points, it's you arranged by addressing these stereotypes or misconceptions, and that's what the whole thing is. So each section is arranged around maybe a specific stereotype or misunderstanding that you want to address, to explain like the stereotype, where you think it comes from, like what you understand about it, and then correct it using your research. So if you're trying to clear up misconceptions, that's a great model. Problem solution pattern. This model works if you're, again, solving a problem or evaluating several possible solutions. So either you have a clear solution or you want to weigh in on several. This works for both. And this is pretty straightforward, I think, with the problem solution. Like most people can kind of figure this one out. Oh, sorry, it did the thing again where it jumps. You begin with like the current problem that you're trying to solve. So like talking about the problem, showing why it's important, showing evidence for that issue, going through like problematic solutions or practices that are used and why they're in place, and then end with your solution, why it might be better. So you might go through like other ideas, like what the problem is, other ideas for solutions, like what they, why they may, why they may work or might not work, like what could be good or bad about them, and then your solution and why it, would work the best. So again, one problem people run into with these like problem solution, advantages, disadvantages, that kind of stuff, is that what you want to really avoid doing is having an introduction to really large body sections and a conclusion. You would want to split up this discussion. So like just discussing the problem could be several sections or subsections. So these are like bigger parts of the paper, but not necessarily like your sections. You might still have background or sections for different solutions that you want to cover, different points you want to make. So just kind of be aware of that. The cause and effect pattern, like finding the correlation. So I want to see if like there's a correlation between like fast food and obesity. I know a lot of you are doing some things like this. So this model can be organized by going through either the issue and then all of the effects of that thing. So like what people are doing and then the effects, like talking about increased screen time, like what's going on maybe today with increased screen time, maybe with COVID, all this stuff, and then talk about its impacts for the rest of the paper. Or go through the current issue and then talk about potential causes, like talk about the problem of pollution and then talk about the largest like contributing factors. Okay, so what you want to make sure you're doing is end with whichever point you want to make. One common error people will run into is they've actually gone through their argument first, or what they believe is the stronger point first, and then they end with the other side, which is really confusing to the reader because it makes it seem like you have a different opinion than you do. So you want to make sure whichever side is the strongest, whichever side is what you want to leave readers with, is what you end with. Okay, next is advantages and disadvantages. Again, reminder, it's better to end with the point you want to make. This is straightforward. It's whether or not, and there's always going to be both. Like I have a lot of people struggle with this one because they are like, well, there are advantages and disadvantages. That's great, but are there more disadvantages that you see, or more, which one kind of weighs out to you based on your research, and that's where you want to go with it. So like if you're wanting to convince others of disadvantages, you would start with the advantages from the research, like what people see as positives, and then explain where you see the disadvantages, and either explain why there are more, or why they're more impactful, or why some of the advantages really are faulty, that kind of stuff. So again, if you're arguing that while there are many clear advantages to children using technology, but the bad outweigh the good, you would start by explaining the positives in the first part of the paper, and then use the final part to explain what the negatives are, why they're more significant or impactful. So just kind of an example there. Last one is the Rogerian argument. This model is really great for controversial issues, or issues where there are very distinct solutions. It can also work really well for like from problem solution models, because they're very similar. So you can sometimes use this model for arguments where, like, when I say it's controversial, usually the thing that's going to happen is you're probably not going to change the reader's mind in a couple of pages. But you could take a step in the right direction. And again, we talked about academic argument being argument to be heard, not necessarily to like be so invested in changing people's minds that you're like leaving out stuff, manipulating, like poorly wording things. But you can contribute to the conversation and take a step in the right direction. And again, you can pull for like problem solution. I'm going to explain how this works. So this is actually based on psychology. Carl Rogers came up with this method, and it is used for conflict resolution, either talking it out or written. So it's a common argument model, and you can pull from these ideas for any kind of writing that you're doing. Well, where'd it go? There it is. So what you would cover first is the other perspective. You would want to be careful to note valid or understandable concerns. There's almost always like some kind of shared concern or something you want to both see that you can talk about, or even good points that they might make. You then present your own argument. So it's almost like their side, my side. Again, not large paragraphs or sections, but kind of splitting it up, like maybe their reasons and then your reasons. So rather than almost like that point by point, you're doing it in these big blocks. Like here are the other side's reasons. Here's why they work. Or here's like what's understandable about them. Switch it up. Here's my side. That is not an invitation to be like really nice when you're going through their side and then like rip them a new one in the next part of the paper. You still want to maintain that fair tone, you know? And then you end with a solution that maybe concedes some part of your own opinion, like it's a compromise in some way, or you're able to explain why your side actually meets their needs. So it's like their side, your side, a solution that where the goal is to make both sides happy, to address both sides' concerns and see if there's maybe like some common ground. So your thesis again here is you might do almost like a problem solution, and it is pretty similar. It just kind of follows more of a very careful way of addressing the other side. You might put that thesis statement again at the beginning of your section, maybe that last part, and then maybe come back to it in the conclusion. And in the next video, we're going to get into addressing other perspectives.